Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. This is City Talk. But the talk today, like last week, is not about New York, but the United States and its place in the world. The place for figures of Greek myth, Daedalus and his son Icarus, is the labyrinth on the Isle of Crete, where they are imprisoned. Daedalus is an architect, and though trapped by land and sea, reasons he can escape by air. He constructs wings of wood, wax, and feathers. To continue from Edith Hamilton. They put them on just before they took flight. Daedalus warned Icarus to keep a middle course over the sea. If he flew too high, the sun might melt the glue and the wings would drop off. However, as stories so often show, what elders say, youth disregards. As the two flew lightly and without effort away from Crete, the delight of this new and wonderful power went to the boy's head. He soared exultingly up and up, paying no heed to his father's anguished commands. Then he fell. The wings had come off, he dropped into the sea, and the waters closed over him. Peter Beinart has recast the ancient myth into a contemporary American tragedy. His most recent book, Icarus Syndrome, A History of American Hubris, chronicles a century of U.S. policy, arrogance, and ignorance. Peter is Associate Professor of Journalism and Political Science at CUNY, a colleague of mine at the Graduate School of Journalism. He is Senior Political Writer at the Daily Beast and a contributor to Time magazine. He is also Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation, and from 1999 to 2006, Peter served as the editor of the New Republic. I have sometimes argued with his new book and his earlier book, The Good Fight, Why Liberals and Only Liberals Can Win the War on Terror and Make America Great Again. Welcome back, Peter.
My pleasure.
So last week we talked about Osama bin Laden and the impact on U.S. and foreign and military policy. We talked a little bit about domestic politics, Arab revolutions, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, and Iran. Those of you who missed it, go to the website. Okay, this week we'll talk about the Icarus Syndrome, but before we get to that, I want to turn to an article that you wrote in the New York Review of Books that caused a firestorm. It created hysteria in some quarters. Talk about this piece, the failure of the American Jewish establishment. We'll talk a little current events, and then we'll talk history. And, well, this is history, too.
My argument in the piece is that there is a profound struggle going on in Israel for the future of Israeli democracy. Israeli democracy is imperiled by the fact that for 44 years, Israel has occupied territory, the West Bank, where it does not live up to its own promise in its Declaration of Independence to provide the right of citizenship to all people, irrespective of religion. And that American Jews, given our own liberalism, our own commitment in the United States historically to liberal values, should be involved in that struggle. But the American Jewish organizations are not. They have a kind of see no evil, hear no evil view of what happens vis-a-vis in Israel, and that is part of the reason many younger liberal-minded American Jews are turning away from Zionism, which in my mind is a tragedy.
Talk about this 2003 Frank Luntz focus group, what it found, what it produced, and the reaction to it.
So there's been enormous anxiety on the part of American Jewish leaders about the fact that American Jewish college students don't feel very connected to Israel. And Luntz was sent out to survey them, and he found indeed that they were not very connected to Israel. And then, but then what he found when he tried to kind of to sell different messages about Israel to them was that they reacted very badly to messages which were essentially anti-Arab or anti-Muslim. That the messages that they responded well to were messages which really had to do with connecting to Israel as a democracy, as a country that shared their values, the values that they consider to be central to their Jewish identity. And it seems to me that's what American Jewish organizations need to struggle for in Israel.
Okay, and having read this carefully and carefully highlighted it, underlined it, some of the things you say were bound to raise hackles and release criticism. Quote, "The liberalism of the American Jewish establishment is fake."
What I meant by that is if you look at the websites of the major American Jewish organizations and you look to answer this question, why should we as American Jews support Israel? They always say we should support Israel because Israel is a liberal democracy. And yet, when faced with the really profound threats to Israel's future as a liberal democracy, for instance, from Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's foreign minister,
talk about it,
the leader of Benjamin Netanyahu's second largest party, who in his youth was a member of Meir Kahana's explicitly racist party, Kach, who has devoted his entire career to trying to humiliate and disenfranchise Israel's own Arab citizens. The American Jewish organizations, with small exceptions, were virtually silent. American Jewish organizations praise Israel for its democracy, and Israel has a lot to be proud of about the democracy that it's established within its 67 lines. But they rarely publicly challenge the reality that in the West Bank, Israel is not a democracy, and that if Israel becomes further and further entrenched in the West Bank, it puts Israel's entire democracy in question. That's what I mean when I say their liberalism is fake.
Okay, another quote that builds on what you just said. Quote, "Not only does the organized American Jewish community mostly avoid public criticism of the Israeli government, it tries to prevent others from leveling such criticisms as well. In recent years, American Jewish organizations have waged a campaign to discredit the world's most respected international rights group." So you're arguing that there is this suppression of discussion, and that is, in a sense, a goal of the establishment? I mean, this sounds a little bit like Pat Buchanan's Amen Corner analysis.
No, look, there is lots and lots of discussion of Israel in the United States, in the press, including much of it by Jews. But I think what I think American Jewish organizations do, many of them, is they attack human rights organizations that document Israeli human rights abuses. They essentially suggest that because Israel is a democracy, Israel should be largely immune from criticism of its own human rights policies. I think that is a very, very problematic position to take for this reason in particular. Much of what the international human rights organizations are saying, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, echoes what Israel's own human rights organizations are saying. Mm-hmm. There has been a campaign by this Israeli government to discredit and make it much harder for those internal Israeli human rights organizations to operate. They are crucial to Israel's success as a liberal democracy, and whether they realize it or not, American Jewish organizations are actually in cahoots with the Israeli government in, I think, trying to clamp down on the ability of Israel's own human rights organizations to expose the things that are done in the West Bank.
Well, let's talk about the Israeli government. Again, quoting from your piece, Israeli governments come and go, but the Netanyahu coalition is the product of frightening long-term trends in Israeli society. An ultra-Orthodox population that is increasing dramatically, a settler movement that is going more radical, and a more entrenched in the bureaucracy and army, and a Russian immigrant community that's racist.
Yeah, let me say, I say this as a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. I was raised to believe deeply in Israel's existence as a Jewish democratic state. That's the way I'm raising my own children, to have that same deep commitment. Mm-hmm. So for me, this is a struggle for Israel to live out the words in its own Declaration of Independence, which promises complete equality of social and political rights, irrespective of race, religion, and sex. When I look at the Israeli government, I see an Israeli government that does not have that same fundamental commitment to those principles in Israel's Declaration of Independence. And some of it is a result of demographic trends. You have the rise of an ultra-Orthodox or Haredi population in Israel that has often a deep antipathy to liberal democratic values. You have this movement of 1 million Russians into Israel in the 1990s, many of them bringing authoritarian political sensibilities. The polling shows this very clearly, from the former Soviet Union. And you have a radicalized settler population, not all of the settler population, but part of the settler population, which really believes that by being in the West Bank, they are involved in a kind of messianic process. And these are a real threat to Israel's future, I believe, as a country that lives out the creed in its own founding documents. And I believe American Jews cannot be on the sidelines in that struggle.
Okay. One of the pieces that you did for Daily Beast in the latter part of December of last year was titled Happy Now, Bibi. And you recount that the United States has buckled on the settlement issue. What do you, and then you've got the recent the Hamas and Fatah reuniting, if you will. What are the prospects for a settlement there? And what would this settlement look like? Or is it this perpetual stalemate? And what's the American role? Lots of questions.
If it is a perpetual stalemate with Israel further and furthering entrenching its occupation in the West Bank, the future for Israel will be very grim. Israel will grow more isolated around the world, which for me as a Zionist will be incredibly painful to watch, because I believe Israel can and should be a light unto the nations, not a pariah nation. Israel has a great story to tell about the country that it is within its 1967 borders. But it cannot convince the world that continuing to entrench an occupation in which Jews are given citizenship and the right to vote and their Palestinian neighbors are not is an acceptable situation. And so even if you didn't believe that that a Palestinian state that we could create it tomorrow, it is crucially important that Israel not foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state one day, and that is in fact what the settlement process is doing. And if it forecloses the possibility, then Israel will be in a very, very different and much, much more difficult reality.
Okay, let's turn to Icarus Syndrome. Talk about the event that you opened the book, your conversation with Arthur Schlesinger, because it really gives personal meaning to your journey as well as the American journey.
So it was the first time only time I ever really met Arthur Schlesinger, who was a professor at City University of New York, great historian, confidant of the Kennedys, a man I admired for many years, read much of his writing, and he asked me to see him, and I was nervous, and he said to me at one point, "Why did your generation support the Iraq War?"
Why did you?
And in fact, I had been the editor of the New Republic when the New Republic supported the Iraq War, and
gave me agita many times.
And I didn't know how.
I cursed you.
I thought about that question a lot, and it was part of the reason that I wrote this book, because I think that my support for the Iraq War was a profound mistake. And I tried to understand why he asked it as a generational question. And I think that it was very wise. And part of the reason I think that I and many people I knew supported the Iraq War was that we were a product of our set of historical experiences, which was an experience of military success, really starting with Panama and the Gulf War in the late 80s and early 90s, in Bosnia and Kosovo, of economic boom, which led to a sense that resources were plentiful, and of the spread of democracy around the world, which created an optimism about the possibility of democracy taking root in formerly dictatorial societies. And I think what's fascinating is that Schlesinger himself had been a product of an earlier era of success, coming out of World War II, that led his generation, many of them, I think, to make the mistake of supporting America's entrance into Vietnam. And it was this question of cycles, the way success breeds overconfidence, breeds hubris, which leads to tragedy, and a search for a deeper kind of wisdom that made me write this book.
Okay, so I mean, and you need to talk about then the lessons of history. I mean, there's Santayana on one side that says if you don't understand history, you're doomed to repeat it, and then you've got Henry Ford that says history is bunk. I mean, clearly history has lessons, but they're shifting, and the meanings of the lessons are shifted, even if you're looking at the same facts. Talk about your thesis, that there are these periods of hubris, and you lay out 3 of them over the last century. Just give us a synopsis of the thesis and the argument of the book.
So the argument of the book is that foreign policy is a little bit like a guy who goes to Las Vegas.
Ooh.
You put down a bet. If you win, you start to feel good about yourself. Maybe you put down a little bit of a bigger bet. You win again, you start to think, wow, maybe I'm invincible. This is the Icarus Syndrome, right? Why does he go higher and higher? Because he's exhilarated by the power of flight. So my argument is that this is the way American foreign policy sometimes works. That as America succeeds, it tries things and they work. People begin to take on more and more risk. It's like you bet more and more at Las Vegas, and you gradually lose the sense of humility and modesty that you might have had early on. And that this process escalates until it leads to disaster. And that is, then America has the very difficult task of trying to recover the sense of limits, the limits of American power and wisdom, in a country where we don't like to talk about those limits very much.
Yeah, it's can do. We're exceptional. We're God's chosen people. Forget the Jews. We're the secular chosen people. This is the new Eden, no?
That's right. No, in fact, Americans very often have seen themselves in exactly those biblical terms, and that has been part of our genius, is precisely that sense of that American optimism. But it has to be restrained, and this is what people like Reinhold Niebuhr, I think, who I read about a lot in the book, understood so well. There has to be a sense of modesty in recognizing that although it's great to have the dream that whatever Americans will, Americans can do, we also need to be able to step back and say, in fact, the world is a very big, complicated place where we don't control everything. And to believe that the world is putty in our hands is to imagine that we are gods. And that's a view that's going to lead you to a lot of trouble.
And hubris is insolence towards the gods. And you talk about this insolence toward the gods. Okay, let's go to the three periods. You've got Washington on the eve and during and immediately after World War I, the progressive generation, Woodrow Wilson. Then you've got the Camelot intellectuals. You've got Kennedy and Johnson and Vietnam. And then you've got the post-war neoconservatives, the defense intellectuals, and George Bush as president. What are the symptomatic conditions in each of these three that carry across that century?
The first was a group of people who had grown up during periods of enormous success. Who so therefore had enormous faith in American military, economic, and ideological power. And the second was the belief that through war, America could remake the world. And essentially the belief that there had been they had cracked a kind of a code. They had figured out how that if America simply followed a certain path that had brought success in the past, that essentially the world would be putty in our hands.
But also there's a messianic quality to this, that we could remake the world in our image. So you've got Wilson's age of reason, you've got the Kennedy age of toughness, and then you've got the Bush age of dominance. What is it that allows this remaking to continue? I mean, part of it's intellectual, and I think that's part of your role in all this as both an author of the two books, but certainly as editor of the New Republic. The role of the intellectual in creating concepts that are accepted as reality. For example, the domino effect in Vietnam, or the reverse domino of George Bush. If you build a democracy here, all these autocracies will fall. So in a sense, your book is an intellectual history, but it's a journey of an intellectual, you.
Yeah, well, because, look, visions of the world, constructs of the world are inevitable. They're the way we make sense of things. But they're also dangerous. And part of what I talk about in the book is the power of analogy. That people have a very natural tendency to look back to one incident that happened and say, aha, this new incident is just like that. So Vietnam was seen overwhelmingly through the lens of World War II. We had to stop the North Vietnamese because otherwise it would be like Munich, and the dominoes would fall and they would be at our shore, like Hitler. I think Iraq was seen very often through the prism of 1989, through the fall of the Soviet Union, essentially to say that if we had unrelenting force against an enemy, a dictator, that he would fall and that American power and democracy would essentially spread throughout the region. And so part of what the book tries to suggest is we need to train ourselves to be able to see the differences and to understand new environments with enough detail, as George Kennan did. Kennan's great genius, and why I write about him at length, is that Kennan understood the Soviet Union well enough to say the Soviet Union is not like Hitler's Germany. there are fundamental differences, and he could see the differences between Vietnam and the Soviet Union in Europe. And that's what we failed to do.
Just by way of background, George Kennan writes the famous X article in Foreign Affairs that leads to this policy of containment. But as you suggest in the book, in a sense, we learn lessons, but often they're the very wrong lessons.
We overlearn lessons.
Okay, overlearn.
Kennan is a tragic figure because he was the architect of containment. He was the architect of this strategy based on stopping Soviet power in Europe. But he was like Daedalus. He was like a guy who built a great set of wings, but who recognized that you couldn't fly the wings too high. And when he saw people trying to take the wings of containment and apply them to Vietnam, he knew that that was the equivalent of Icarus flying towards the sun. And I think part of the book is about the story of Daedalus figures who come up with ideas that work in a certain set of circumstances, and then Icarus figures who extrapolate in ways that are very dangerous.
Excellent. What are the warning signs?
I think the warning signs are, first of all, that the idea that America is being advised by its allies that this is a bad idea. The argument I make for multilateralism, for why it's worth listening to America's democratic allies, is not that we necessarily need their guns. America can often do things more easily on its own. It's the same reason that if you're feeling a little tipsy, it might be a good idea to ask your friend if you're drunk. Because in fact, there's no line, if two people say you're drunk, lie down. Sometimes it's the same reason you go to a doctor for a second opinion. It's not because you need two doctors to do the operation, it's because sometimes we need an external point of view. It's precisely—
You think in metaphors and analogies. Go ahead.
Precisely because the Europeans, because of their own history, are a little bit less optimistic, a little bit less can-do. That when they all say to us, as they did in Vietnam, and as they mostly did in Iraq, you know what? This is undoable. You can't do it. That we should pause and think a second and third time. That's the value of getting NATO or UN support, because we need people who have a somewhat different history and sensibility but share our basic values to give us an external opinion like a doctor and say, you know what, this operation cannot be done.
Yeah, but the analogy doesn't hold, because when the French and other Europeans just told us, and their publics told us, that they didn't want to invade Iraq, we named them Liberty Fries, Liberty Toast. Come on.
Well,
we're talking about not only elites, but you're talking about the general public ignoring this second opinion.
Well, that was whipped up by elites in a kind of I think a nationalist fervor that served the United States very, very poorly. And I think it's the job of political, intellectual elites, in fact, to resist that kind of know-nothing, we're the A-team, we're the United States, we can do whatever we want. That makes us feel good until the body bags start coming back. And then Americans actually do start to realize, in fact, that there are limits to what we can do in the world.
Yeah, after American troops have sustained thousands of casualties, and Iraqis or Afghanis have suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, and $3 trillion.
And we're living with the consequences
right.
of that, and that has hastened the decline of American power.
Okay, your final chapter in Icarus Syndrome is titled "The Beautiful Lie." What is the beautiful lie? Why is it a lie? And what's the truth?
The beautiful lie is that whatever Americans will, Americans can do. That is a beautiful idea because it's a can-do sensibility, an optimism, a belief that is at the core of our national character. It's the result of our incredible success. I mean, no country has had the run of success in the last 200 years that we have. But it's also a lie because, in fact, there are limits. We are only one nation in a very large world. We are only fallible human beings susceptible to the same mistakes of everybody else. And I think America's most successful political leaders, FDR, and in a way Reagan too, were able to conjure up this myth, this idea, pay tribute to it, allow Americans to bask in it. But when they had to make hard policy decisions, also be able to look at the reality, which was essentially that we couldn't bite off more than we could chew.
Talk about Obama in the context of this presidential leadership. Is he closer to FDR and Reagan? I mean, given what you see with Obama and his foreign policy?
I think actually the killing of Osama bin Laden gives Obama his best opportunity. Because in killing Osama bin Laden, he has exemplified the American can-do spirit. We can go halfway across the world, deep into another country, send our kick-ass SEALs in there and get the job done.
And
that plays to the myth, but then I think it also gives him the space to say what most Americans know in our gut, which is that although we can do incredible things, there's some things we can't do. We can't solve Afghanistan's
Well, then
problem.
the question becomes, is that realization going to happen? Does the light, come on and say, wow,
I think Obama, having given Americans this feeling of power and pride, now has the space to say to them, you know what? There are certain things that are beyond our capacity. We need to focus on rebuilding America at home. And the fact that we can't totally vanquish the Taliban in Afghanistan, just like we weren't able to vanquish the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, we can live with that. We have to tend to more important things at home.
I don't see him giving this speech, though, in the 2012 presidential campaign. What does he say to get elected? Does he say that?
Well, I think the danger is that Obama will do what Lyndon Johnson did in 1964. Remember, Johnson wanted to get reelected and just kick Vietnam down the can.
Yep.
Keep it off the newspapers.
Yep.
By the time he woke up in 1965, we were so deep in Vietnam that it was much harder to get out. It's true that Obama would rather not have Afghanistan be a big issue probably in 2012, but he needs to make sure that that he doesn't turn around in 2013 and find we're in a situation where we're further.
Yeah, but he made it the issue at 2008 to that he was going to be a muscular president. That's how he sold himself.
He did, and
he did, and he surged.
And that's right, and I think it was a mistake. I think if you read Bob Woodward's book about Afghanistan, what's disturbing about that book is you get the sense of a president and a White House whose heart was not really in this, but were being pressured by the U.S. military, the officer corps who wanted to do it, didn't feel like they could have that fight with the military and the Republican Party. And that's, to me, what's so dangerous about Afghanistan, because the policy has been on automatic pilot, and we still don't know whether when Obama says, you know what, we need to turn around and start withdrawing troops, whether he can bring the U.S. military to heel. Because one of the things we learned about wars is that once America goes deep in, and this is the lesson of Vietnam, power shifts from civilian leaders to military leaders, and it becomes very difficult to get the military to do things they don't want to do.
Yeah, but it seems to me, and we've got to close, that Obama is really trying to cut the baby in half.
That's right. I think the Afghan policy has been too clever by half. This short-term surge, we're going to push the Taliban back on their heels, then we're going to start a negotiating process there. The reality is, I don't think we can win in Afghanistan because Pakistan doesn't want us to win. Pakistan wants the Taliban around because they're afraid that if the Taliban's not around, that Afghanistan's going to be a satellite of India and they will be encircled. We can't solve that problem, and I think we have bigger problems on our plate right now.
Thank you. My thanks to Peter Beinart for being on the show. Join us next week here on CUNY TV. Hello, I'm Doug Muzzio. Let us know what you think about this show. You can reach us at CUNY.TV. When you get there, click on the bar that says Contact Us and send your email. Whatever it is. Thanks, no thanks, obnoxious, do it. Send it.